Chris Moore, welcome. And we've taken a while to sort of both of us to tic-tac to find the day that suits us. But here we are at last. I've been dying to talk to you about your new book, Kin Kora, Britain's Shame. You've come in today with some documents that we've been discussing off air, and we will get to this as part of the interview. But it's very interesting that, you know, all these years later, tidbits of information are still coming to you. You're the go-to person on this story, and you have been for decades now. But little pieces of a jigsaw, isn't that what it's like?
That's exactly it.
And little, I mean, one of the documents that we're looking at here has a date on the bottom of it. Just the one bit that isn't redacted because somebody didn't think it was relevant. But how relevant is it? Because it shows that there was knowledge that the man at the centre of this book was abusing boys all the way back in 1972. And it would take 10 years before he would go to court. So for our listeners in the South, I say a lot of people in the North know a good bit about this story. But let's start with Kin Kora and what it was. Home for boys, teenage boys.
The intention was to provide a family home, a family atmosphere in a home.
Yeah.
To take boys from the school age into the workplace. So it was intended to have 14 to 17 or 18-year-old boys. On occasions, however, there were two prominent examples of boys at the age of 11 being transferred there because of the backlog of people that were in the system, and so they ended up being in.
So this is slightly different to Borstal as such, which we would have been very used to down here in Dangan, where young children would have been sent essentially to prison, to these sort of industrial schools. This was actually a home for kids who hadn't done anything wrong, but their families had broken down for one reason or another.
Yes, either they'd lost both parents, as in one case, in a traffic accident, and so there was no other family member, so the boy was placed in Kin Kora. Mostly, though, they were children from broken homes where the relationship between their parents had broken down, and that's why they were placed in care.
And were they taken from that broken family, as you'd call it, or did the parents put them in because they couldn't cope alone?
No, it was a mixture of both.
Right.
But the courts weren't afraid to place young boys from broken homes in Kin Kora if it was the only place that they could put them. And they thought that was a place of safety because at that time nobody realised that the three staff were paedophiles and were sexually raping and assaulting the boys that were there in public care. They were supposed to be looking after these children from very vulnerable and broken backgrounds, and instead they took advantage. And one of them, William McGrath, joined in 1971. The other two had been there from the beginning.
Which was the 1960s?
Well, 1958.
Really? And so let's set the scene there for a second. So 1960, say, for example, we'll settle on that, when this opened for young boys between the age of 14 and 18. So families didn't really separate back then. There wasn't divorce, obviously. So it was unusual for marriages to break down somewhat. The laws around homosexuality were very different. And the sort of, I suppose, the attitude to people around that was like it was a crime.
Well, it was a crime to be a homosexual then. There was no two ways about that. However, when you look at how the police and the public and the managers of social services looked at it, it seems to me that they had a tolerance of homosexuality and they turned a blind eye to it.
Within the care home systems?
Yes, within the care home systems.
And of course, I mean, both of us know that what happened in Kin Kora wasn't homosexuality. It was paedophilia, which is a completely different thing, and probably hebephilia, which is the interest in teenage boys or girls. A slightly different sort of title for it. But so you're in 1960s in Belfast. The boys are in these homes, in this home. They're being taught skills and trades, I suppose, to when they were let into the sort of back into the community, even though they weren't in kind of custody as such. They were in a care home. And two men, you named them or you mentioned them earlier, started managing this.
It was Joe Mains. He was the warden, and 6 years after he started, he got his friend who had absolutely no qualifications. Neither of them had. His friend was Raymond Semple, who worked in Belfast Shipyard, but became his deputy in Kin Kora.
I was interested in that, how sort of two paedophiles had come together, but clearly they were friends on the outside. William McGrath, does he know of them? And how does he come to start working in Kin Kora?
Well, I spoke to Raymond Semple after he'd served his prison sentence. And he told me that neither he nor Joe Mains, who was in charge of running Kin Kora, were aware that a third person was about to be appointed as housefather. So William McGrath came into their realm without any foreknowledge. According to Semple, he said, this man suddenly appeared. It was a fait accompli. We weren't told about it. It was just explained to us that that is the way it's going to be. And McGrath came. And McGrath changed the atmosphere in the home because he was a violent predator.
These other two were already abusing the boys?
Yes.
Okay. And so who employed McGrath? Who ran Kin Kora? It was the British state, essentially.
It was, but it was at the time of his appointment, it was social services in Northern Ireland that ran Kin Kora. And so they would have had to look at whatever qualifications McGrath had. I'm afraid to say he didn't have any qualifications
at all.
So my suspicion, and it is only a suspicion and I don't have any real grounds for it, but maybe it was necessary for the British surveillance operation that was being conducted by MI5 to have someone in Kin Kora because it was in a unionist area and boys were being influenced by the unionist people who were running the home. Mains, Semple, and finally William McGrath.
People will wonder why MI5 is coming into a story like this, but of course it's central to it. MI5 were already interested in Kin Kora, the goings-on in it, before McGrath becomes appointed out of the blue to sort of he's the manager of it, essentially. Well,
McGrath, when he, in 1958 or early 60s, went to Dublin, MI6 were interested in where exactly he was going and who he was going to see. And they thought they might see him meeting somebody from the KGB. As it happens, according to the Hart report, which I have to say isn't inspiring when it comes to telling the truth, but he claims that actually, McGrath met 3 communists from South American countries, and that came from intelligence documents. And so McGrath had attracted the attention of MI6. And then when MI6 were sort of moved to the side in the early 70s and MI5 took over, McGrath became their eyes and ears in the unionist community. And that included his endeavours in the hostel that was Kin Kora, because obviously there were other paedophiles interested and abusing those children. Some of them were being taken out of Kin Kora to bars where they would be fed with drinks, and then they would be taken upstairs or asked to go upstairs and to visit men. I asked one of the boys one time, did you recognise any of these men you met? And he said, no. Remember, I'd been plied with drink and my concentration was from the waist down. I didn't look up to see who it was.
Jeez. So we have a situation that 2 paedophiles are operating a care home in East Belfast where there's young, vulnerable boys. a man called William McGrath. I'm going to get you to explain to us his bit of background about him. But he is placed in there out of the blue as the manager. He is already somebody that we know MI6 have been interested in back in the late 50s, early 60s. Your investigations have ultimately considered that he's an agent for MI5, and your suspicion is he's placed in there on purpose.
Well, that's maybe the only way when you learn from somebody like Semple that neither he nor the warden of the hostel, Joe Mains, knew that McGrath was coming. McGrath was appointed as a house father, which is like third in charge. He's the third person in. And he immediately changed the atmosphere within Kin Kora. This was a man who was married with children of his own. He was a virulent Protestant. He was very much anti-Catholic. He was very much anti-Republicans. And he led his life in so many different departments. So his life as a homosexual was one compartment. His life as a paedophile was another compartment, and his life as a leading member of the Orange Order was another compartment. He had a sense of Irishness about him. He created his own Orange Lodge, which had a Gaelic inscription on their banner, and he wanted a united Ireland, but he wanted it under a Union flag. And he was telling his followers in Tara, which began as a secret Orange Order group.
Tara was the name of his lodge, was it? Or was it
no, his lodge was called the Ireland's Heritage Lodge, 1303. No, Tara was a ginger group set up within the Orange Order, and it was to discuss the impending doom that McGrath predicted. McGrath was telling his followers that he was getting information from MI5. He worked with MI5. He was able to predict with some degree of accuracy events as they unfolded. And as the Troubles unfolded, his followers would see that what McGrath had said was coming true, that there was a plan, for example, by the Irish Republic to invade Northern Ireland, if that was to get the United Nations involved. To look after the Catholic population, which was under siege by the Loyalists. So they went along with him. The UVF became involved. This is the Ulster Volunteer Force. They went in because they heard that McGrath had keys to get weapons brought in, and indeed McGrath did bring weapons in from Holland to Belfast.
So he's an incredibly political character. He's quite important, really, because he's preaching, plus he's at the centre of unionist politics and their aspirations for Ireland. He's also, MI5 would believe, somebody who is hearing and able to foresee violence and other aspects of security that they would need to be on top of and ahead of. So he's a significant character for them. You talked about his life in different departments or compartments. So his paedophilia and his homosexuality, are they of interest to MI5? Do they care, or are they an aside?
Well, interestingly, Brian Gemmell, who was a captain in Army intelligence, who was working very closely with and on McGrath, trying to follow what was happening in the unionist community, he would say that, yes, that's the kind of proposition that would interest intelligence services. So was McGrath key to bringing them in touch with other paedophiles who were interested in young boys from Kin Kora? That's entirely possible. It would mean that the British state would have some leverage on unionists who happened to be either homosexual because it was illegal or were paedophiles, and they wouldn't want their families or their constituents or their voters to know exactly what they were.
Or their churches or whatever.
Exactly.
So basically you have MI5 are interested in him then for a number of reasons. Firstly, he is a key to holding secrets from other influential figures that they can use as leverage or for blackmail, essentially.
Yes.
Or certainly they'll keep it in their back pocket for the day they need it. That little, particular secret or hidden aspect of someone's life. But he's also mixing in political circles and with people that's of interest. Kin Kora, back to it, he's put in there. So from an intelligence gathering point of view, Kin Kora, I'm looking at this, it's full of 14 to 18-year-olds. How are they of any use to MI5 intelligence gathering?
Well, they're only of use in the fact that they will be survivors of sexual abuse by adults. And it's the adults that would be of interest to the intelligence services of Britain. And remember, in the early 70s, I spoke to an army intelligence officer who came over here in the early 70s, and he said, we had no intelligence on the Protestant community, on the Unionist community. What we had were a number of index cards in a shoebox. Now, that had to change, and so I can understand why McGrath was of interest to them. I understand why he became what he did, an influential player. I mean, he was known to a wide number of senior establishment figures in England. I mean, one of the sponsors of his group, Tara, was a man called Sir Knox Cunningham. Sir Knox Cunningham was the MP for South Antrim. He was also a key figure in the British government. He was the secretary to Prime Minister Harold Macmillan for many years. And so he knew Sir Knox. Sir Knox then takes us to other people like Anthony Blunt, like Peter Montgomery, who was a sort of aristocratic individual whose family were quite wealthy and had two estates. One was in Northern Ireland and one was in Warwickshire. And Montgomery was a homosexual. His lover, and especially during the Second War, was very important. His lover was the Queen's picture equerry, and that was Sir Anthony Blunt. And Blunt wasn't and hadn't been exposed as a Russian spy at that time. But he was coming over to Blessingbourne, which is in 5 Mile Town, to see Peter Montgomery during the Second War, when Montgomery was a captain in British Army intelligence, and he would come home for rest and respite. It would make for very interesting pillow talk, I would have thought. But,
yes.
But we didn't know that at the time, and nor did the British know that.
So he had sort of tentacles spreading into really important places, and I suppose he's almost, ultimately, if you keep following those tentacles, he's sort of reaching into the royalty, which is essentially what MI5 is about, protecting the royals, isn't it? So, sort of since the opening of Kin Kora, what your investigations have concluded, there was widespread sexual abuse of the boys. The boys have claimed that they were not only just sexually abused within Kin Kora, but they were sort of essentially brought places and possibly to be given up to influential people in Northern Irish society, that MI5 wanted to get a full handle on this so they could gather that intelligence, that back pocket or lean on you intelligence. So they put a paedophile in above the head of the two paedophiles that were running it.
That's exactly what appears to have happened. And I have no proof that MI5 put McGrath in there. That's purely supposition on my part, that if the management of the hostel wasn't told, the people who had the power to do exactly what happened, that is to put a third person into the hostel who had strong connections and who would pass on information to them, and that was entirely possible that MI5 did it. McGrath built a small community of influential unionists, young unionists around him. Not all of them, of course, were in any way homosexual or paedophiles, but they were gathered in with him. He sent young men, to places in South Africa where they could get proper military training, where they could have access to guns. And so he was involved in gun running, not only from Amsterdam, but also had interests in South Africa. McGrath had people, and this is where I think it's very interesting. McGrath got a group of people who became influential in the Unionist Party, and who ultimately became government ministers. Now, the reason they became government ministers was because there was a power-sharing agreement when peace broke out after 1994's ceasefires. And what was better to have in the Unionist community for the British government, who were kind of desperate to stop the war and probably to get out of Northern Ireland altogether, was to have people who were amenable to a kind of an Irish influence on the way in which things happened. So we had influential unionists who went into government, Nelson McCausland, for example, Reg MP. Those are two examples. And the whole family of McGraths, they were interwoven with unionism in a very influential way.
Mm-hmm. So you have a very complex web of politics and power, and I suppose that bubbling war that's coming, and the powers, the most powerful people really on the two islands involved. And then you have this layer of boys who are like the fodder in this intelligence gathering ultimately. And what's happening to them is horrific sexual abuse within a care home facility. We are very used to hearing, unfortunately, these stories of this happening. But the boys are like, when people were growing up around Belfast and that, and Kincora, were the rumours slipping out? Because usually when something's going on, there's never smoke without fire, but you hear things. Was Kincora becoming totally notorious? Were young boys growing up coming out and making complaints? Were any of them that had parents left making complaints in the years, I suppose, between the 60s and the 70s until eventually it was investigated?
It appears there wasn't any growing public awareness of what was going on in Kincora, but there was certainly awareness with social workers,
right,
and with the parents of boys. There is a record, and I could show you a long list of complaints that occurred from the 60s. I think the first complaint that occurred was in 1962.
Right.
And then there were 64, 66, 67, there were complaints. And Joe Mains was a master of assuring parents, social workers, even the police, that he had a great way of, what would you describe it as, plausible deniability.
Yeah, excusing things that were alleged.
Yes. So he would say, oh, yes, he's complaining that I looked down inside his pants and pulled his. I had to do that because I had to be sure the boys were changing their underwear and they had clean underwear. That was one of the excuses that was used by Joe Mains.
And was there, when they were just there, you say that the ante was upped when McGrath comes in. Was it more sexual assault, or was there rape occurring? Was there complaints of rape?
There were complaints of rape against McGrath. The other two
but prior to his arrival, what were the nature of the complaints?
Well, the nature of the complaints was of sexual assault, that the boys would waken up and there'd be somebody with their hands in their underwear underneath the bed sheets when they were being wakened in the morning. It wasn't quite... if there was sexual relations, it was more gentle.
Yes.
It was sometimes. I spoke to one boy who lived in London and who, when he was free and had holidays, he'd come back to see Joe Mains. And Joe Mains looked after him, especially, he says, when he was a boy there. So it was done in a more gentle fashion.
But at the
McGrath
same
changed
time,
that.
they were bringing them out to other men during those years. Were they in the 1960s?
Well, I'm not sure about that, the 1960s. I do know that was happening in the 1970s.
After McGrath's arrival.
McGrath arrived.
So before his arrival, there are complaints,
yes.
but Mains is able to kind of square them off.
Yes.
And he's able to give an explanation why X happened. Some complaints are made and they're investigated by social workers, but they don't go anywhere.
Yes.
So in comes McGrath and everything changes.
The level of complaints exponentially just rose when McGrath became a member of staff at Kin Kora. He was known for his violent approach. This was a dark side of William McGrath, one that only the survivors of abuse knew about, because it happened in their bathrooms in Kin Kora. It happened in their bedrooms in Kin Kora. McGrath was, I could describe one boy who said that he was raped violently by McGrath in the bathroom. And he was left in a very pained and painful backside, which was bleeding. And yet a few days later, when the wound was beginning to heal finally, he was raped again by McGrath. And the wound was reopened. So that McGrath didn't have any empathy or care for the boys. He often told boys, if you cooperate with me, I've got a friend who could supply you with an apartment when you leave Kin Kora. Not any of the boys that I've ever met took him up on that offer, but there were two who talked about that offer being made to them. Not all the boys in Kin Kora were victims or subjected to sexual violence or abuse. But the ones that Joe Mains and William McGrath and another paedophile in another home were interested in, they shared that information about those young people. And those young people would be the cornerstone of the paedophile ring. Now, George Caskey was the police officer from the RUC, as it was then, who investigated Kin Kora. 3 investigations he did. And he acknowledged that boys were being taken outside, but he denied it was a paedophile ring.
So that was by the early 1980s then that investigation ultimately got underway after a number of failed investigations. But in around Belfast at that point, things are happening. There's, you've got 2 decades of boys sort of maturing and coming out of Kin Kora. You have complaints being made. There must be stories whirling around, is there, about this? Is Kin Kora becoming a place that's quite toxic by reputation?
Well, it would have been with the boys who had to live there and experience this for themselves. And it would be the kind of thing, I mean, I remember when I was at school, there was comments made about particular adults. Oh, if you drop 2 shillings piece on the floor, don't bend down to pick it up. That kind of chat. I imagine that was going on within Kin Kora and within the confines of the home where the boys were concerned. But it never seemed to reach out to the general public until the 24th of January 1980, when the Dublin paper, the Irish Independent, and their reporter Peter McKenna wrote a story about a homosexual vice ring at a boys' home in East Belfast. It didn't name the home, but it didn't take long for any of us that were interested that morning. Where is he talking about? We could quickly, and did quickly.
And you knew damn well it was Kin Kora.
Well, I had to ask, but I got that answer from social workers. And I think social workers were very much aware of the allegations. The police were very much aware because they'd been to Kin Kora, and the boys watched the police come, and every time the police would walk away and there would be no prosecution. So the boys were really disappointed because they believed that no one was going to believe them.
They had no voice.
That's correct. They had no voice at all. Now, the reason the Irish Independent got the story was because 2 female social workers had had enough.
Okay.
They learned that one of the boys, Richard Kerr, who was in their care, Richard Kerr was making noises whilst in custody and in a courtroom that suggested there was some kind of hold that Joe Mains had on Richard Kerr. And they made sure that Kerr was sent to Borstal because of criminal activities he and another boy had engaged in. And when he was in 1979, these 2 social workers wrote up a report in which they defined their suspicions about homosexuality and a hold on Richard Kerr that involved the warden of the home. They were asked to remove that from their report, which they did under orders, but they did not remove it from what they had written themselves. They kept a record of their original report. And that's what they shared with Peter McKenna from the Irish Independent. And that was the beginning of the end of Kin Kora, because the police were tasked to investigate. And I know from George Cascade, that I knew quite well, within 3 days, he said he knew there was a case to answer.
And that's not very long, is it, in investigation terms, like at all? But that headline even in itself, so it's gone from allegations of sexual misappropriation within a care home to a vice ring. That's a huge, big, step. That's happened really over the almost 10 years that William McGrath is there in charge. So we have him there. Presumably the social workers who wrote up the report and made the complaints that formed the sort of the whistleblowing expose in the Irish Independent didn't realise this stuff that was going on in the ether. They didn't realise that McGrath was MI5, that he was giving information, that he was feeding information into his own community. And that probably, if we were to take that as the narrative of what was happening, that he was identifying people of the paedophile persuasion within his own community and was offering them up, these boys, in order to pass on that information back to MI5.
Well,
how could you think that?
Yes, exactly. You've hit the nail on the head that the 2 social workers became suspicious, but they were suspicious only of one thing, that the warden of the home had some kind of hold over one of the residents from the home. They were unaware of any paedophile ring. McGrath was engaged in self-gratification and sexually raping the boys. But the principle behind the paedophile ring was Joe Mains. And that has emerged since the court case in which the 3 Kin Kora staff were jailed. It was after they were jailed in December 1981 that the story grew legs, and the interest in the story was this talk about MI5 having some link to Kin Kora. And I remember being in the court on the day in which 6 men were before the court, 5 of whom had admitted their charges. So they were put back into the cells to allow for the trial of the one person who was contesting the charges, and that was William McGrath. Except on the morning of the trial, his barrister decided to visit him in the cells, spoke to him, came back to the court and said, my client would like to be rearraigned. So William McGrath was brought up And he was put in the dock, and a number of charges, a reduced number of charges were read, and he admitted guilt. So all of us in the court, especially in the press box, were extremely disappointed because there was no
Evidence.
ventilation.
Yeah.
Exactly. There was no ventilation. The truth was still in the ether, but it was barely touchable. But I had good sources who helped me with understand the MI5 interest in Kin Kora. And I had
and to try and untangle what had happened, essentially,
Yes.
and what had gone on. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.